You've heard the song. Maybe you heard it from your parents. Maybe it came out of a jukebox in a diner or drifted through a radio speaker on a long drive through the Carolinas. Maybe you only know the chorus and never thought much about what it meant. In 1958, the Kingston Trio sold 6 million copies of that song. It launched the American folk revival. It put a dead man's name on every radio station in the country, and then the world. But the man they were singing about had been dead for 90 years by then. He'd been hanged in the town of Statesville, North Carolina, on the first day of May, 1868. He was 23 years old. His name was Thomas C. Dula, and if the people who actually knew him, the ones who lived in those mountains, who knew the full weight of the story, if they were right, then the wrong man died on that gallows. This is not the version they put in the song. The Yadkin Valley sits in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, in the northwest corner of North Carolina. In the summer of 1865, it smelled like wood smoke, creek water, and something that didn't have a name yet. The particular smell of a place that has survived something it wasn't supposed to. The Civil War had ended in April, but endings on paper take a long time to reach mountain communities. The men came back slowly. Those who came back at all. They came back thinner, quieter, with something removed from behind their eyes. The farms they returned to were not the farms they had left. The economy had collapsed. Families who had never had much now had almost nothing. The federal government called this period Reconstruction. In the Yadkin Valley, people called it survival. It was into this world, frayed, suspicious, and raw, that Thomas C. Dula walked home in June of 1865. He had enlisted in March of 1862, when he was 17 years old. He signed up as a private in Company K of the 42nd North Carolina Infantry Regiment. He was not unusual in this. In a community like Elkville, in Wilkes County, military service was as ordinary as planting corn. Boys his age had few other options. By 1864, he was serving as a drummer, not because he was too young to fight, he was past that age by then, but because someone had recognized something in him worth keeping out of the direct line of fire. He was hospitalized at the Episcopal Church Hospital in Williamsburg, Virginia. He was later captured at Kinston and sent to Point Lookout, a Union prisoner of war camp in Maryland. Point Lookout had a reputation. It was a flat, windswept peninsula at the mouth of the Potomac River, exposed to the worst of Chesapeake Bay winters. The barracks were overcrowded. The rations were thin. Disease moved through the population the way fire moves through dry grass. Men who arrived healthy left, if they left, with something broken in them that never fully healed. Tom Dula was released on June 11, 1865, after signing the Oath of Allegiance to the Union. He was 20 years old. He had seen more of death than most men see in a lifetime. He walked back to Wilkes County with his discharge papers and the particular heaviness that settles into a person who has been to war and come back to find that the world didn't hold still while they were gone. He went home to Elkville, and Elkville for Tom Dula meant one thing more than anything else. It meant Ann Melton. Her name before she married was Ann Triplett. She had grown up in the same hollows and hills as Tom, in the same web of small farms and tightly knit families that made up the community of Elkville. She was known for two things: her beauty, which was the kind that people in isolated communities talk about for years, and her temper, which was the kind that people in isolated communities talk about quietly. Tom had known her since he was 14. By the standards of their world, that was not unusual. In a community where everyone knew everyone, and where marriage often happened young, long relationships that started in adolescence were common. What was less common, though not unspoken about, was the nature of what existed between Tom and Ann after she married James Melton. James Melton was a shoemaker. He was also a veteran of Gettysburg, which meant he had seen the worst single day of killing in American history, and had come back to Wilkes County carrying his own share of whatever Point Lookout had given Tom. James was steady, quiet, and entirely aware of what was happening under his roof. Because it happened under his roof, Tom Dula and Ann Melton conducted their relationship with a frankness that was either brazen or desperate, depending on how you looked at it. Tom would stay at the Melton house for nights at a time. Anne's husband slept in the same building. The community knew. The community talked. And the community, as communities in those mountains tended to do, kept its deeper judgments mostly to itself. What the community could not keep to itself, eventually, was what happened next. Because in March of 1866, a woman named Pauline Foster arrived. Pauline Foster was a cousin to both Anne Melton and Laura Foster. The tangled family structures of Elkville meant that the same surnames and bloodlines crossed and recrossed in ways that are hard to map from outside. She came to the Melton household in the early spring of 1866 to work as a domestic servant. She also came because she was sick. The disease had a local name that people used when they talked about it in hushed tones. The pock. What we would call it today is syphilis. In 1866, syphilis was not unusual in communities where the social structures enforced by war had dissolved. It was poorly understood, incurable, and treated with preparations that were often as dangerous as the disease itself. Mercury compounds mostly, administered in doses that could cause tremors, tooth loss, and neurological damage. A course of treatment was called blue mass, and it left visible marks on those who underwent it. Pauline had the pock. She was being treated for it when she arrived at the Melton house. And somewhere in the weeks that followed, the disease passed from her to Tom Dula. Tom passed it to Anne Melton. Tom passed it to Laura Foster. This is the biological core of what happened in Wilkes County in the spring and summer of 1866. It is not a detail the Kingston Trio included in their song. It is not a detail that appears in the 1959 film about Tom Dooley. But it is the detail that the prosecution would use 2 years later to explain why Tom Dula had a motive to commit murder. And it is the detail that, examined carefully, begins to suggest that the prosecution's story wasn't quite right. Laura Foster was Wilson Foster's daughter. She lived on her father's farm, in the way that unmarried young women in Elkville lived, working the household, tending the animals, existing in the close orbit of family and neighbors that constituted life in that place. She was also, by various accounts, part of the same tangled social world as Tom Dula and Anne Melton. She was Pauline Foster's cousin. She was known to Tom. She was, by the spring of 1866, involved with him in some capacity that the historical record captures only partially, described by contemporaries in the language of the era, language that made clear she was not regarded as entirely innocent or passive in these arrangements. By May of that year, there were rumors circulating in Elkville. The rumors said that Laura was pregnant. The rumors said that Tom intended to run away with her, to leave Wilkes County, to leave Anne Melton, to start somewhere new with Laura Foster as his wife. Whether those rumors were true, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is this: Anne Melton heard them. In a place like Elkville, everyone heard everything eventually. The morning of May 25th, 1866 began before the sun reached the center of the sky. Laura Foster rose early. She went to her father's stable. She saddled his mare, a roan horse that Wilson Foster would later describe at the trial, and she tied a bundle of her clothes to the saddle. She rode away from her father's farm in the direction of a place called Bates Place, where she was apparently expecting to meet someone. Wilson Foster woke to find his horse gone and his daughter gone with it. He was not immediately alarmed. Young people in Elkville kept their own schedules, and a daughter leaving before dawn was not, by itself, a cause for panic. Then the horse came back. The next morning, the mare appeared at Wilson Foster's farm. She was alone. The bundle of clothes was gone. The lead rope, the rope used to tie the horse, had been chewed through. Not cut, chewed. The way an animal chews through a rope when it has been tied to a tree and left long enough to become desperate. A horse coming home without its rider doesn't announce itself. It just appears. And in that silence is a specific kind of dread that people who keep animals recognize immediately. Laura Foster was gone. The horse had been left tied to something and had freed itself. No one would see Laura alive again. Wilkes County spent the next several weeks in a state of agitated uncertainty. Laura Foster was missing. The community began to talk in the way that small communities talk when something goes wrong. In circles, in whispers, with the particular intensity of people who have known each other their entire lives and suddenly need to figure out who did what. Tom Dula became the primary suspect almost immediately. This was not random. In the weeks before Laura's disappearance, Tom had been making what the court records describe as public threats, statements about what he intended to do to whoever had given him the sickness. He had not been subtle about it. People had heard him. People remembered. But Tom Dula did not stay in Wilkes County long enough to be questioned formally. He ran. He crossed into Tennessee before the body was found, before any charges were filed, before the machinery of justice had even started its engine. In the mountains, running was sometimes a survival instinct rather than a confession of guilt. But to the people of Elkville watching him go, it looked like one thing. It looked like guilt. The body was found in June of 1866. It was found near Bates Place, the area where Laura had apparently been heading that May morning. It was in a shallow grave. It had been there long enough that identification required looking at clothing and dental characteristics rather than the face. Laura Foster had been killed by a single stab wound to the chest. One blow, directly to the heart. Whoever did it had known what they were doing, or had been very lucky, or had been driven by something that made precision possible even in a moment of violence. The grave was shallow. It was the kind of grave dug in haste, or in the dark, or by someone who expected never to be discovered. Here is the detail that the official record struggles to explain. The grave was found because Pauline Foster led the search party to it. Pauline Foster, the woman who had arrived at the Melton house sick, the woman who was the first person in this chain to be treated for syphilis, a fact that would become legally significant, the primary witness for the prosecution. She knew where Laura Foster was buried. At trial, nobody asked Pauline Foster in a direct and sustained way how she came to know exactly where to look. Tom Dula was caught in Tennessee by a man named James Grayson, a local figure who helped the authorities apprehend him. This is the same Grayson who would later appear in the folk ballad, transformed almost beyond recognition. In the song, Grayson becomes a romantic rival, a heroic figure who contrasts with the villainous Tom. In reality, he was simply a member of the search party who happened to be present when Tom was found. Folk songs do this. They take the raw material of history and reshape it into the forms that stories need: heroes, villains, love, betrayal. The truth is, usually more complicated and less satisfying as a 3-minute song. Tom was brought back to North Carolina. He was charged with the murder of Laura Foster. Ann Melton was charged alongside him. The trial was moved from Wilkes County to Iredell County on the grounds that the community of Wilkes was too inflamed to produce an impartial jury. This was a reasonable concern. By the time the case came to court, Tom Dula had already been tried and convicted in the court of public opinion. Tom Dula's defense attorney was Zebulon Vance. This requires a moment to appreciate. Zebulon Vance was not a small-town lawyer. He was a former governor of North Carolina. He was one of the most prominent political figures in the state. He was a man of exceptional rhetorical gifts, who had spent the war years navigating the impossible politics of a Confederate state that contained a large population of Unionists. He knew how to read a room. He knew how to construct a narrative. That a man of Vance's stature took this case suggests several things. Either he believed in Tom Dula's innocence, or he saw in the case something worth fighting, a principle, an injustice, a story that deserved to be told differently. Perhaps both. The prosecution's case rested on 2 pillars. The first was motive. Tom had publicly threatened to harm whoever had given him syphilis, and the prosecution argued that he believed Laura Foster was the source. The second was circumstantial evidence: his flight to Tennessee, his relationship with the victim, his presence in the community where she disappeared. Vance attacked the motive pillar directly. He pointed out, correctly, that Pauline Foster had been the first person in this chain to receive treatment for syphilis. The medical logic of the prosecution's case required that Laura Foster had infected Tom, who had then sought revenge. But if Pauline was treated first, she was almost certainly the original source, which meant Tom's supposed motive for killing Laura was based on a false premise. It was a strong argument. It was not strong enough. The jury convicted Tom Dula. Ann Melton was acquitted. Read those two sentences again because they are the heart of this story. Ann Melton, the woman who, by multiple accounts, knew exactly where Laura Foster's body was buried before the official search found it. The woman with an established history of violent jealousy. The woman who, according to testimony later collected by historians, had reacted to the rumors of Tom's plans to run away with Laura, with a fury that people around her remembered for decades. That woman walked out of the Iredell County Courthouse a free woman. Tom Dula was sentenced to death by hanging. The case was appealed to the North Carolina Supreme Court. The Supreme Court found procedural errors in the original trial and ordered a new one. The second trial produced the same result: guilty, death. By May of 1868, all the legal roads had run out. The town of Statesville, North Carolina. The first day of May. A crowd had gathered, as crowds did in that era for public executions, not because people were cruel, but because public executions were considered a form of civic order, a demonstration that the law had teeth. Tom Dula was led to the gallows. He was 23 years old. He had survived Point Lookout prison camp, a war, a syphilis infection, and 2 murder trials. He had not survived the verdict. Before the drop, he spoke. He raised his hand toward the assembled crowd and said, "Gentlemen, do you see this hand? I never touched a hair on that girl's head." Those were his last public words. The contradiction in what Tom Dula left behind is the engine of everything that followed. He had, at some earlier point, written a document that could be read as a confession, or, depending on how you read it, as a carefully worded statement designed to take responsibility while protecting Ann Melton. He denied culpability to the last breath. He maintained, in the most literal and physical way available to him, raising his hand before a crowd, that he was innocent of the act he was being hanged for. A man who is genuinely guilty and facing death tends not to bother with the performance of innocence. It costs something to stand there and insist. It means something. The rope dropped. Tom Dula died. And the mystery didn't die with him. It deepened. Ann Melton lived for years after Tom was hanged. She had walked out of the courthouse free. She had watched her lover die on a gallows while she went home to a life that continued. In the mountains of North Carolina, in the communities that knew these people, certain stories collected around Ann in the years after the trial. They were the kind of stories that circulate in places where oral tradition still carries the weight that writing carries elsewhere, where what people say to each other in kitchens and on porches constitutes a form of historical record. The story said that Ann Melton did not die quietly. On her deathbed, she screamed. She said she saw black cats crawling the walls. She said she smelled burning flesh. She was not, by these accounts, a woman at peace with herself. In the culture of the Appalachian Mountains, these specific images, the black cats, the burning smell, the terror at the moment of death, had a recognized meaning. They were the signs of a soul that had committed something it could not outrun. The mountain people who remembered Ann Melton did not primarily remember her as a woman who had been acquitted. They remembered her as a woman who had died badly. That's a different kind of verdict. Historians who have examined this case in depth, and there have been several working from the court records, the testimony transcripts, and the collected oral histories of Wilkes County, have largely converged on a single alternative theory. Not a guess. Not a hypothesis without evidence. A theory supported by the testimony that was available at the time and either ignored or underweighted by the prosecution. The theory is this: Ann Melton killed Laura Foster. The motive is clearer than any motive attributed to Tom. Ann had been Tom's obsessive partner since he was 14 years old. She had maintained their relationship across her own marriage, through the war, through Tom's return. The rumors in May of 1866 that Tom was planning to leave with Laura, to marry Laura, to start a new life, were not abstract news to Ann Melton. They were an existential threat. Anne was also, by every account, capable of extraordinary rage. The temperament that people described, beautiful, volatile, intensely jealous, is not the temperament of someone who absorbs abandonment quietly. Then there is the question of the grave. Multiple pieces of testimony, including statements collected by later historians from people who had known the Melton family, indicated that Anne knew where Laura Foster's body was before the official discovery. Not vaguely, not approximately. She knew. You know where a body is buried for one of two reasons. You buried it, or someone told you where they buried it. If Tom told Anne, why would he? Why would you share that information with someone who had nothing to do with the crime, who could use it against you, who was already on a short list of suspects? The logic of secrecy points in the other direction. If Anne knew where the body was because she put it there, then Tom Dula's written statement, the one that could be read as a confession, becomes something different. It becomes what Tom always seemed to be doing in the months before his execution, protecting the woman he had loved since he was a boy, even at the cost of his own life. Pauline Foster is the most unsettling figure in this story, precisely because she sits at the center of it and receives the least scrutiny. She was the source of the syphilis that set the chain of events in motion. She was the primary witness for the prosecution, the person whose testimony did the most damage to Tom Dula in front of the jury. And she was the person who led the authorities to Laura Foster's grave. Consider what it means to be the person who finds the body. In a case where the location of the body is unknown, where searches have turned up nothing, where weeks have passed, the person who finally leads a search party to a shallow grave in the woods has answered a question that everyone else couldn't. The natural follow-up question is, how did you know? Pauline Foster gave explanations. Those explanations were accepted. But historians who have combed through the Iredell County criminal action papers have noted that the level of scrutiny applied to Pauline's knowledge of the grave location was not equal to the scrutiny applied to Tom Dula's flight to Tennessee. Pauline also had her own reasons for wanting attention focused elsewhere. She was the first person treated for syphilis, which meant the prosecution's narrative about Tom's motive, that he was seeking revenge on the person who infected him, potentially pointed back at her, rather than at Laura. Shifting the jury's focus to Tom and Laura's relationship served Pauline's interests directly. None of this is proof that Pauline Foster killed Laura Foster, or arranged for it, or participated in any way. But it is evidence that the investigation in 1866 left significant questions unasked, and that the people who had the most to gain from Tom Dula's conviction were also the people who supplied the most damaging evidence against him. There is a third alternative theory, less argued for but worth acknowledging: James Melton. James Melton was the man whose wife was sleeping with Tom Dula. He was a Gettysburg veteran, which means he had the psychological and practical experience with violence that the war produced in men who survived its worst days. He had been publicly humiliated for years by a situation that the entire community knew about. If Tom was about to leave with Laura, to finally leave, to actually exit the community, then James Melton's humiliation would end. Or it would be replaced by a different kind of humiliation, the kind where your wife's lover leaves not for you, but for someone else. The theory holds that James could have killed Laura to incriminate Tom, to remove both problems at once, the affair and the rival. Most serious analysts of the case dismiss this theory. James Melton's behavior before, during, and after the trial doesn't suggest someone managing a complicated deception. He was, by every account, a steady, practical man. Not someone who executed elaborate revenge plots, but he is part of the picture. Every person in that community is part of the picture, and the picture, looked at as a whole, does not point clearly and exclusively at Tom Dula. Tom Dula died on May 1st, 1868. Almost immediately, a local poet named Thomas Land wrote the first verses of what would become Tom Dooley. The song was a kind of cultural obituary, a way for the community to mark what had happened, to process it, to pass it on. The name in the song was not Dula, it was Dooley. this was not an error. In the dialect of Wilkes County, in the particular way that Appalachian English softened and reshaped vowel sounds at the ends of words, Dula was pronounced something close to Dooley. The folk process had already begun, not by changing the story, but by reflecting the way the story actually sounded in the mouths of the people who lived it. The song spread the way songs spread in mountain communities before recorded music existed, from voice to voice, from porch to porch, from one generation to the next. It was not preserved in a single authoritative form. It mutated as all oral traditions mutate, picking up new verses here, dropping old ones there, reflecting the concerns and the memories of whoever was singing it at any given time. For decades, it was primarily a regional tradition. People in Wilkes County sang it. People in the surrounding mountains knew it. Outside of that world, it was obscure. The song might have stayed obscure forever if not for the folk collectors. Beginning in the 1920s and accelerating through the 1930s and 1940s, ethnomusicologists and folk archivists began moving through Appalachia with recording equipment, capturing the oral traditions that were being threatened by modernization. The goal was preservation, to get these songs on tape before the last people who knew them died, without passing them on. Frank and Ann Warner were among these collectors. In 1938, they recorded a version of Tom Dooley, performed by a banjo player named Frank Prophet, who had learned the song from his family. Prophet's version was raw and unhurried, with the particular gravity that a song has when the person singing it believes the story is true, because it is true, and they know it. Alan Lomax, the most famous of the folk archivists, was also working in this period. The Lomax recordings and the Warner recordings became the source material for the folk revival that was building in American cities. Young people from places nothing like Wilkes County, who were drawn to the emotional directness of Appalachian music. From Frank Prophet's banjo to the Kingston Trio was a path that took 20 years. But once it connected with the force of a freight train. The Kingston Trio was three young men from California, Dave Guard, Bob Shane, and Nick Reynolds. They wore matching shirts. They were clean-cut and collegiate and performed with a polish that was a long way from Frank Prophet's front porch. In 1958, they recorded Tom Dooley and released it as a single. It sold more than 6 million copies. It reached #1 on the Billboard Pop Chart. It won the Grammy Award for Best Country and Western Performance in 1959, the first Grammy ever awarded in that category. It was played on radio stations from New York to Los Angeles to London. It launched the American folk revival. Before Tom Dooley, folk music was a niche interest, an academic pursuit, a subcultural enthusiasm. After it, folk music was pop music. Peter, Paul, and Mary, Joan Baez, a young Bob Dylan who arrived in New York in 1961, directly into the world that the Kingston Trio had created. None of this would have happened without the death of Thomas C. Dula in Statesville, North Carolina, in 1868. And here is what the 6 million people who bought that record didn't know. The song was wrong. The Kingston Trio's version of Tom Dooley told a story of a love triangle. Tom loved a girl. Something went wrong. He killed her. He was caught by Grayson, presented in the song as a romantic rival. He would hang down his head. He would cry. It was a clean story. It was an emotionally satisfying story. It fit neatly into 3 minutes and sold 6 million copies. But the Grayson in the song was not a romantic rival. He was a member of a search party who helped apprehend Tom in Tennessee. The song invented a role for him that did not exist in the historical record, because the story needed a hero to stand against the villain, and the actual story didn't provide one tidily. The song contained no syphilis, no Pauline Foster, no Ann Melton on her deathbed seeing black cats, no shallow grave that was discovered by the person who may have known where it was all along. No second woman tried and acquitted while the man alone went to the gallows. The song contained no ambiguity. This is what folk songs do with complicated history. They compress it. They smooth the rough edges. They remove the parts that don't fit the emotional shape the song needs to have. The result is something that is easier to sing and harder to question, and that passes from generation to generation as the truth, wearing the costume of truth, carrying the emotional authority of truth, while the actual truth gathers dust in the Iredell County criminal action papers. Every person who ever sang, "Hang Down Your Head, Tom Dooley," was singing about a man who died loudly, insisting he had not touched a hair on that girl's head. The song turned that insistence into a confession. It took his name and buried it in a narrative that served the story's needs rather than the man's reality. Tom Dula hanged for a murder he may not have committed. The song that made him immortal convicted him again, and this time there was no appeal. In the years after the trial, after the hanging, after Ann Melton's troubled death and James Melton's quiet continuation of his life, Wilkes County kept its own version of the story. The official version, Tom Dula, murderer, executed, was the version on paper. The mountain version was more complicated. In Wilkes County, people knew Ann Melton's history. They knew what she'd said on her deathbed. They knew that Pauline Foster had led the search party to the grave. They knew things that the court records didn't capture, and that the Kingston Trio's song never touched. Oral tradition in isolated communities serves a function that official records cannot. It preserves what happened in the spaces between the documented facts, the things people observed and couldn't prove, the things they whispered but wouldn't say under oath, the details that didn't fit the prosecution's narrative but that the community recognized as true. For more than a century, Wilkes County carried the burden of knowing that what the world believed about Tom Dooley was not quite what had actually happened in those hills in 1866. The year after the Kingston Trio's hit, Hollywood produced The Legend of Tom Dooley, starring a young Michael Landon. The film followed the broad outlines of the Ballad rather than the historical record. Tom Dooley was portrayed as a Confederate soldier on the run after the war, who becomes caught up in a tragic romance. The film was not a documentary. It was not intended to be, but it added another layer to the cultural construction of Tom Dula, another version of the story that had nothing to do with Pauline Foster's knowledge of a shallow grave or Ann Melton's deathbed screams. By 1959, Tom Dula had been through 3 transformations. He had been a real man, executed in 1868. He had been a character in a regional folk song, sung in the mountains for 90 years. He had been a pop music sensation, simplified and polished and sold to the world. Now he was a movie character, played by an actor who would later become famous playing a very different kind of character on a very different kind of show. Each transformation moved further from the truth and closer to the myth. Each one made the real story harder to find. In 2001, 133 years after Tom Dula was hanged, citizens of Wilkes County, North Carolina, submitted a petition to Governor Mike Easley. They were asking for a posthumous pardon. The petition argued what the mountain tradition had always held, that Tom Dula had not received a fair trial, that the evidence against him was circumstantial and compromised, that the alternative theories pointing to Ann Melton and Pauline Foster had never been adequately investigated. The governor's office did not act on the petition formally. The state of North Carolina did not issue a posthumous pardon, but Wilkes County did something of its own. The county held a ceremony, a symbolic absolution. It was not a legal proceeding. It had no binding force. But it was a community choosing to say, publicly and on record, "We think this may have been wrong. We think the man who hanged for this may have been the wrong man." That's not nothing. 133 years is a long time to carry a doubt. Standing up in front of your neighbors and saying it out loud is a different thing than whispering it in kitchens. Laura Foster is buried in Wilkes County. Her grave has a marker. She was a real woman who rode away from her father's farm before sunrise on a May morning in 1866 and never came back. Whatever she was, whatever complications and contradictions the historical record assigns to her, she was a person who died young and violently, and who deserved better than to have her death become a folk song that didn't tell the truth about what happened to her. Tom Dula is buried in Ferguson, North Carolina, on land that belonged to his family. His grave also has a marker. Ann Melton's grave is harder to find. The case, the actual case, the documents, the court records, the criminal action papers from Iredell County, exists in the North Carolina digital collections, available to anyone who wants to look. It is dense reading, the language of 19th century legal proceedings, full of formalities and abbreviations and the particular bureaucratic distance that court documents put between themselves and the human events they describe. But it's there. The evidence is there. The gaps are there. The questions that weren't asked are visible in the spaces between the questions that were. The Kingston Trio's version of Tom Dooley is also still there, on every streaming platform in existence. You can hear it in 30 seconds if you want to. It still sounds the way it sounded in 1958. Clean, harmonic, emotionally direct. It is a very good song. It was a very efficient story. But between the song and the court records is a distance that measures something important about how we remember violence, and who we decide to remember it about, and whose version of events gets to be the one that lasts. Tom Dula stood on a gallows in Statesville, raised his hand and said he had never touched a hair on that girl's head. Then he died. The song that made him famous says he did it. The woman who may have actually done it died screaming about black cats on the walls. Somewhere in the Yadkin Valley, if you listen carefully enough, you might be able to hear the difference.